In 1950, a man with an 8th-grade education and a borrowed $1,000 opened a coffee and donut shop on Southern Artery in Quincy, Massachusetts. By the time his empire reached its apex, that single modest storefront had multiplied into more than 14,000 locations scattered across 39 countries. Every single day, millions of Americans walked through those orange and pink doors without a second thought. Walk into any Dunkin' on a Tuesday morning in Boston, and you understood what this brand meant to the working world. The air smells of hot grease and brewed coffee. Construction workers in heavy boots lean against the counter. Nurses still wearing their hospital IDs check their phones. A father holds 2 paper cups in a brown bag while his daughter picks out which munchkin she wants. No pretense. No minimalist wood paneling, no chalkboard menus written in cursive. Just coffee. Fast, cheap, hot, reliable. At its peak, this company was moving $6 billion in annual global sales. Its logo, neon orange smashing into hot pink, was recognized on site by 97% of Americans. The phrase, "time to make the donuts," had entered the American vocabulary as naturally as any nursery rhyme. Dunkin' Donuts was not a restaurant chain. It was a daily ritual, baked into the rhythm of working-class life. Then, the world began to shift. Starbucks arrived. Younger consumers started ordering lattes with Italian names. A homegrown Canadian competitor named Tim Hortons dismantled Dunkin's presence in an entire country. Corporate owners rotated in and out. A pandemic shuttered hundreds of locations overnight. And the company that once defined morning America quietly stripped the word donuts from its own name, as though ashamed of what had made it great. So how does a brand born from a Depression-era dropout's survival instinct become a corporate footnote absorbed into a private equity portfolio? What forces conspired to unravel a company that once seemed unshakable? This is the story of the rise, the roar, and the quiet fading of America's most democratic coffee empire. Welcome inside the Dunkin' machine, where for 70 years they made the donuts, until one day they stopped. 1930, Dorchester, Massachusetts. The neighborhood sits just south of Boston proper, pressed close to the harbor, full of triple-deckers and working immigrants and corner stores that stay open late. It is a neighborhood where people know each other's business, not because they are nosy, but because survival often requires it. William Rosenberg is 14 years old. His father's grocery store has just collapsed under the weight of the Great Depression. There is no safety net. There is no plan B. There is only the immediate and pressing need to bring money home. He drops out of school in the 8th grade. He shines shoes on street corners. He shovels snow from stoops for nickels. Eventually, he lands a job as a telegram delivery boy for Western Union, earning $22 a week. He is methodical and driven, and people who work alongside him notice something unusual. This kid does not just do the job. He studies it. He watches how things move, how routes are laid out, how efficiency compounds over time. These are not the observations of a child. They are the habits of a future industrialist. By the time William Rosenberg reaches his 20s, he has graduated from messenger to management positions in food distribution. He works his way up through a company that sells ice cream from refrigerated trucks, rising from branch manager to national sales manager. When World War II begins, he pivots again, taking a job at Bethlehem Steel Corporation in its shipbuilding operations outside Boston. He is disciplined, adaptable, and hungry, in a way that Depression-era childhoods tend to produce. After the war ends, Rosenberg makes the move that will define the rest of his life. He takes $1,500 he has accumulated in war bonds, borrows an additional $1,000 from family, and launches a mobile catering company called Industrial Luncheon Services. The concept is simple: converted trucks with hinged sides that open to reveal sandwiches, beverages, and snacks, delivered directly to factory workers and construction crews across Greater Boston who cannot leave their work sites for a meal. Within months, the fleet grows. Within a few years, it swells to nearly 200 trucks, 25 in-plant cafeterias, and a full vending operation. The revenue is substantial. But as Rosenberg reviews his sales ledgers, one pattern seizes his attention. 40%, every time. Coffee and donuts. Not sandwiches, not soup, not the premium lunch offerings, coffee and donuts. Cheap, fast, essential, account for nearly half of everything his enterprise earns. The workers are voting with their dimes, and their message is unmistakable. What would happen, Rosenberg begins to wonder, if you built a whole business around just those two things? Memorial Day, 1948, Quincy, Massachusetts. The storefront sits inside a former awning store at 541 Southern Artery. It is not elegant. The equipment is functional rather than beautiful. The menu is stripped down to its essentials: donuts and coffee, with 5 varieties to choose from and a price of 5 cents a donut and 10 cents for a cup of coffee. Rosenberg calls the place the Open Kettle. Many people told him the 10-cent coffee would fail, twice the typical retail price at the time. Nobody, they said, would pay that much for a cup. They were wrong immediately. The shop is mobbed. Rosenberg grosses more than $5,000 in a single week from this one small location. The secret is not magic. The coffee is simply better, made with higher quality beans that the elevated price point allows him to source. His customers in the factories had taught him that quality, when it came to coffee, mattered more to people than the price. He had already proven this with his catering trucks. Now he proved it with 4 walls and a glass display case. 2 years later, in May of 1950, Rosenberg gathers his executives in a room with a tape recorder for a naming brainstorming session. The name Open Kettle lacks momentum, lacks identity, lacks the verbal snap that a growing brand requires. His architect, Bernard Healy, is the one who lands on it: Dunkin Donuts. The deliberate informality of Dunkin, the dropped G, the blue-collar ease of it, communicates exactly what Rosenberg wants. This is not a place for ceremony. This is a place for people who are moving. By 1953, the company introduces its first formal logo. The following year, a mascot named Dunky arrives, a cheerful cartoon figure with a donut for a head and a coffee cup for a body. In 1955, Rosenberg takes the step that will transform a neighborhood success story into a national empire. He begins selling franchises. It is a relatively new business model at the time, still treated with skepticism by the traditional business establishment. Rosenberg becomes one of its most passionate champions, eventually going on to co-found the International Franchise Association in 1960. His partner, Harry Winokur, disagrees with the franchise direction entirely. The partnership dissolves. Winokur starts his own donut company, Mr. Donut, and the two men who once shared a counter will spend the next several decades on opposite sides of the same market. It is a rivalry that will only be resolved decades later, when one empire absorbs the other. The first Dunkin' Donuts franchise opens in Dedham, Massachusetts in 1955. The brand has begun its long march. 1963, Canton, Massachusetts. Robert Rosenberg is 25 years old when his father hands him the presidency of Dunkin' Donuts. It is a remarkable moment, a founder stepping back, trusting his empire to the next generation before the empire is even fully formed. The 100th Dunkin' Donuts location opens that same year. 100 stores, 100 franchisees, each of whom has committed their own capital and labor to the Rosenberg vision. The machine is working, but the company exists inside a strange structure at this point. Dunkin' Donuts is a subsidiary of Universal Food Systems, a conglomerate assembled from 10 small food service businesses. The result is organizational chaos. Walk into one Dunkin' Donuts and you might find a full breakfast menu with eggs and sausage. Walk into another and the only things on offer are donuts and coffee. There is no consistent customer experience, no unified brand identity. The 100 locations feel, in some ways, like 100 different restaurants wearing the same sign. Robert Rosenberg methodically dismantles the confusion. He sells or closes the other businesses in the universal portfolio. He standardizes the menu and the shop format. He enforces operational consistency across the franchise system with a discipline that his father, more of a visionary than an operator, had not always imposed. The early 1970s bring the first muffins to the menu. In the early 1980s, self-service counters replaced the traditional over-the-counter service model, and ceramic mugs give way to paper cups. Faster, cheaper, more compatible with the on-the-go consumer that Dunkin' increasingly serves. In 1968, the company goes public. Wall Street embraces it. The franchise model generates royalty income with relatively low capital expenditure from the corporate parent, a structure that the investment community of that era is only beginning to fully appreciate. The stock performance is solid. The growth trajectory is clear. And for a brief moment, Dunkin' Donuts looks like exactly what it is: a quiet, unstoppable American machine. By 1970, the first international location opens in Japan. The Tokyo store in Ginza launches with curiosity and real success. Southeast Asia follows. South Korea becomes a major market. The brand that William Rosenberg built from a borrowed $1,000 is now feeding morning routines on the other side of the planet. Meanwhile, back in Massachusetts, a new threat is taking shape. Not from another donut company. Not yet. The threat is still subtle, still distant, still wrapped in the innocuous guise of a man named Howard Schultz, tinkering with espresso machines in Seattle. The 1980s, America at large. If you lived in New England in the 1980s and early 90s, you did not choose between Dunkin' Donuts and Starbucks. Starbucks barely existed outside the Pacific Northwest. You chose between Dunkin' Donuts and getting your coffee from a gas station or a diner. And there was no real choice at all. Dunkin' Donuts had already won this market. What it needed now was a face, a human embodiment of what the brand stood for. In 1981, the New York advertising agency Alley and Gargano created a television campaign that would run for 16 uninterrupted years and inscribe itself permanently into the American cultural vocabulary. The character they invented was called Fred the Baker, played by actor Michael Vale. 300 actors auditioned for the role. Vale was not the agency's first choice. They had initially preferred the well-known character actor Lou Jacoby. But when Vale walked into his audition in pajamas, bleary-eyed and muttering his single assigned line in a tone of resigned, half-awake duty, the room knew they had their man. Time to make the donuts. The campaign ran over 100 individual commercials across 16 years. Fred the Baker became one of the most recognized advertising characters in American history. The Television Bureau of Advertising named the original 1981 commercial one of the 5 best advertisements of the decade. The catchphrase entered everyday speech, appearing in television shows, political speeches, and the broader cultural conversation as shorthand for unglamorous but necessary labor. In September of 1997, when the campaign finally ended and Michael Vale retired from the role, Dunkin' Donuts gave away nearly 6 million free donuts across the country in Fred's honor. Bob Dole, Larry Bird, and Sugar Ray Leonard appeared in farewell commercials, offering the beloved baker their retirement advice. By 1998, Dunkin' Donuts has 2,500 locations worldwide, pulling in $2 billion in annual sales. The footprint is enormous. The brand recognition is near total. In 1990, the British company Allied Lyons acquires the chain through its Baskin-Robbins holdings, and almost immediately moves to consolidate the market further by absorbing the Mr. Donut chain, the same company founded by Harry Winokur, William Rosenberg's original partner and ultimate rival. In a single corporate maneuver, the company eliminates its oldest American competitor and converts those locations into new Dunkin' Donuts stores. The empire is at its widest. But something is already stirring underground. If you are finding this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into history. We are just getting to the part where everything starts to crack. And trust me, it is not pretty. 1996. Seattle, Washington, and Quebec, Canada, simultaneously. Howard Schultz has been building Starbucks since the mid-1980s with a very different philosophy. Where Dunkin had always bet on speed, value, and the working-class morning rush, Schultz was betting on atmosphere, aspiration, and the emerging American appetite for self-improvement. His stores were not fuel depots, they were destinations. The coffee was Italian-influenced, the menu was in a language that required some decoding, and the experience was deliberately unhurried. In the mid-1990s, the number of coffee houses in the United States was doubling roughly every 5 years. By 2001, it would double again. This should have been a warning. Dunkin did not read it as one. Meanwhile, in Quebec, a different catastrophe was developing in slow motion. Since 1961, Dunkin Donuts had dominated the Canadian donut and coffee market, particularly in the French-speaking province where it had built more than 200 locations. Franchisees there reported enormous loyalty and consistent traffic. Dunkin Donuts was not just a brand in Quebec, it was part of how people marked their mornings. Then Tim Hortons arrived. Founded in Hamilton, Ontario in 1964, the chain had spent decades as primarily an English-Canadian phenomenon. In 1996, it launched an aggressive expansion campaign into Quebec. It had something Dunkin Donuts could never manufacture: a Canadian identity. Tim Hortons did not need to advertise its foreignness because it had none. It was local in a way that no American import could replicate, regardless of the marketing budget. The Quebec franchisees saw what was coming immediately. In 1996, they began sending alerts to the company's then-owner, Allied Domecq, describing what they called the Tim Hortons phenomenon, a wave of competition that threatened to erase their market position. They asked for 3 things: a meaningful advertising investment, a store renovation program, and a promise of active support. Allied Domecq sent back what amounted to a set of weak incentives, and a renovation program that most franchisees found too expensive to justify. Tim Hortons multiplied from 60 locations in Quebec in 1995 to 308 by 2005. Dunkin's Quebec market share collapsed from 12.5% to 4.6% over the same period. 210 stores became 115, then 41, then 25, then 13. The greatest failing, a Quebec Superior Court judge would later write, was the company's failure to protect its own brand. 2003. Quebec Superior Court. 21 former Dunkin Donuts franchisees filed a formal lawsuit against Dunkin Brands Canada Limited. Their collective claim was precise and damning. The parent company had made specific contractual promises to protect and enhance the Dunkin Donuts brand in the Quebec market, and it had broken every one of them. The plaintiffs alleged that the company had lured them into a costly store renovation program that never materialized, backed away from a promised $40 million marketing investment, and then stood by as their businesses were destroyed by a competitor that Dunkin's own leadership had been warned about years in advance. The company defended itself with 2 arguments. First, it claimed that the collapse was due to franchisee underperformance and poor upkeep. Second, it blamed factors outside its control, specifically the Tim Hortons phenomenon. These were not unreasonable defenses on their face. The renovation program had indeed seen poor uptake from franchisees themselves, and Tim Hortons had been an exceptional competitor in a category it understood deeply. Quebec Superior Court Justice Daniel Tingley was not persuaded. In his ruling, delivered in June of 2012, he awarded the franchisees $16.4 million Canadian dollars in damages plus legal costs. The language of the judgment was not diplomatic. He described Dunkin's actions as too little, way too late. He wrote that the greatest failing of all was the company's failure to protect its brand in the Quebec market. The Quebec Court of Appeal upheld the verdict in 2015. By 2016, after years of appeals and accumulating interest, the final settlement approached 18 million Canadian dollars. But the legal cost was almost secondary to the practical devastation. By mid-2017, only 3 Dunkin Donuts remained in all of Canada. One was a freestanding store that still made donuts on site. The other 2 were food court kiosks, dependent on delivery from that single remaining kitchen. A chain that once commanded 69% of the Canadian donut market had effectively ceased to exist. In September of 2018, the company formally refused to renew its franchise license to the surviving stores. Every remaining Canadian location closed or rebranded as an independent business. After 57 years of operating in Canada, Dunkin Donuts surrendered an entire nation to a single competitor it had refused to take seriously for a decade. The lesson cost $18 million. The damage to the brand was beyond calculation. December 2005, Canton, Massachusetts. The sale announcement arrives quietly, the kind of corporate transaction that generates press releases before it generates much public emotion. Dunkin' Brands, by now encompassing both the Dunkin' Donuts and Baskin-Robbins chains, has been sold to a consortium of 3 private equity firms: Bain Capital, the Carlyle Group, and Thomas H. Lee Partners. The purchase price is $2.4 billion. The seller is Pernod Ricard, the French wine and spirits company that had acquired the brand through a series of corporate consolidations following Allied Lyons and Allied Domecq. William Rosenberg's neighborhood donut shop has now passed through the hands of a British food conglomerate, a French liquor company, and is now the property of 3 American investment firms, with no particular attachment to Boston, or to coffee, or to the working-class identity that the brand spent 50 years cultivating. Private equity ownership changes the nature of a company in ways that are rarely visible from the street. The operational pressures do not disappear. The franchise system, the royalty streams, the coffee machines, the paper cups, all of those continue unchanged. But the underlying logic of the organization shifts. The time horizon compresses. The performance metrics tighten. Every decision must justify itself against a financial return target that has a defined exit date attached to it. The new owners move headquarters from Quincy, where Dunkin Donuts was born, to Canton, Massachusetts, a suburb chosen more for logistical convenience than for any sentimental reason. They invest in growth, pushing toward a target of 10,000 American locations and aggressive international expansion. By 2010, annual global sales reach $6 billion. The brand goes public again in 2011 under the NASDAQ ticker DNKN, allowing the private equity consortium to begin extracting returns while maintaining operational control. On paper, the story looks like success. Revenues are substantial. The franchise model generates healthy royalty income with minimal capital expenditure. By 2018, coffee accounts for 60% of all Dunkin' sales, a dramatic inversion of the original donut-led menu. The brand is still dominant in the northeastern United States, still embedded in the morning routines of millions of consumers. But the company's identity is becoming contested, blurred, uncertain. Is it a coffee company or a donut company? Is it trying to beat Starbucks at its own game? Or is it defending its traditional working-class position? The executives keep changing, the strategy keeps shifting. And out west, where Dunkin' had withdrawn from California in 2002, Starbucks continues to accelerate. September 2018, Canton, Massachusetts. The announcement is framed as a celebration, a fresh start, a bold forward movement. Dunkin' Donuts, the name that had been pressed into the American consciousness for 68 years, the words that anchored the most successful advertising character in the brand's history, the identity that workers from Dorchester to Derry had claimed as their own, is being retired. Going forward, the company will simply be called Dunkin'. The marketing logic is straightforward, and it is not wrong on its own terms. By 2018, donuts represent less than 40% of sales, while beverages, coffee, iced coffee, cold brew, espresso drinks, frozen beverages account for the majority of revenue. In a culture where the word donut carries associations with indulgence that the health-conscious consumer is increasingly anxious about, stripping it from the brand name signals a pivot. New espresso machines are installed across all locations. A new espresso recipe is developed and launched nationwide. The slogan, "America runs on Dunkin'," remains, but the connotation shifts from a donut and coffee stop to a coffee shop that also sells donuts. The response is decidedly mixed. Long-term customers in New England feel a quiet, formless loss. Not exactly grief, but the particular disorientation that comes when a familiar institution rearranges itself without asking. The phrase, "time to make the donuts," now belongs to a brand that no longer wants to be defined by donuts. The paper donut boxes still carry the tribute to Michael Vale's retired Fred the Baker. But the institutional will to protect that identity is visibly diminishing. New CEO Dave Hoffman, who came to Dunkin' from McDonald's, speaks in the vocabulary of transformation. By simplifying and modernizing the name, he tells journalists, the company creates new energy. The goal is to be an on-the-go, beverage-led brand in a fast-moving, competitive market. The company is racing to install mobile ordering, digital loyalty programs, and delivery partnerships to capture a younger demographic that orders its lunch on its phone and expects its coffee shop to behave like a tech startup. These are not wrong instincts. They are simply the instincts of a different company, one that is trying to become something it was never quite designed to be. The brand that William Rosenberg built was honest in its lack of pretension. The new Dunkin' is honestly pretending. But here is what nobody was fully accounting for. A pandemic was 18 months away, and it would not care about rebranding strategies. 2006 through 2019, across America. The franchise relationship has always been the structural engine of Dunkin's model and its greatest source of tension. William Rosenberg himself had faced the complexity of it. His original partner, Harry Winokur, had opposed franchising entirely, and the friction had dissolved the partnership. But the deeper contradiction within franchising is structural and unavoidable. The franchisor and the franchisee share a brand, but not necessarily a vision. A name, but not always an interest. Between 2006 and April of 2008, Dunkin' Donuts filed lawsuits against franchise owners 154 times. In the same period, Donald's, with a far larger global footprint, was involved in 5 such lawsuits. Subway, with 4 times as many locations as Dunkin', filed 12. The asymmetry was stark and drew significant press attention in 2008, with franchisees publicly alleging that the company was forcing single-store owners into buyout situations at unfavorable terms, leveraging minor infractions as pretexts for termination. The franchise model is only as stable as the trust that underlies it. When franchisees feel that the parent company is a predator rather than a partner, compliance erodes, and so does brand quality. A customer who walks into a Dunkin' in New Hampshire and then into one in Virginia is making a bet that the experience will be recognizable. When that bet fails, when the donut is dry, or the coffee is weak, or the service is indifferent, they do not blame the individual franchisee. They stop going to Dunkin'. In September of 2019, a new legal front opened when the New York Attorney General's office filed a lawsuit alleging that Dunkin' had mishandled a series of cyber attacks on its mobile app. The attacks, which occurred in early 2015, resulted in the theft of thousands of customer usernames and passwords. The lawsuit alleged that company employees had been aware of the breaches and had failed to take appropriate action or notify affected customers in a timely manner. The reputational damage was compounded by the timing. Digital trust was becoming a core consumer concern, and Dunkin' had fumbled precisely that issue at precisely the wrong moment. Meanwhile, in the international markets, the stories were piling up. Sweden filed for bankruptcy in 2018. Israel had collapsed under debt in 2001. Australia had retreated. China never achieved its stated targets. The empire had developed cracks in so many walls at once. We are halfway through this incredible story. If you are enjoying it, do not forget to like and subscribe. Your support means everything to us and helps keep these deep dives coming. The worst part of this story is still ahead, and so is the final reckoning. March 2020, the United States. The coronavirus pandemic arrives not as a single catastrophic event, but as a sustained, rolling demolition of the assumptions on which most American businesses had been operating. For Dunkin', the damage is immediate and particular. The brand had spent 2 decades positioning itself as the coffee of the morning commuter. The person who stops on the way to the office, buys a medium hot coffee and maybe a breakfast sandwich, and drives the rest of the way to work. In March of 2020, that person simply stays home. The commute disappears, the office closes, the routine dissolves. By July of 2020, Dunkin' Brands announces it will permanently close 800 stores in the United States before year's end, due to a 20% drop in second quarter revenue. That revenue figure translates directly to real numbers. $287.4 million in the second quarter of 2020, compared to the same period in 2019. The equivalent of more than a $60 million quarterly loss against the previous year's baseline. 450 of the 800 closing stores are inside Speedway gas stations, a segment of the business that had always underperformed on margins and that the company now used the pandemic as justification to finally exit. In New York and Boston, the very cities where Dunkin' was most deeply embedded in the morning fabric, urban store sales fell so far below expectations that the company's chief financial officer, Catherine Jaspon, acknowledged them separately in public commentary. The workers who had defined Dunkin's customer base were not commuting. They were not stopping for coffee. They were making their own at home, or ordering delivery, or making do. Meanwhile, in October of 2020, a report appeared in the New York Times. Dunkin' Brands was in talks with Inspire Brands, a private equity-backed holding company that owned Arby's, Buffalo Wild Wings, Sonic Drive-In, and Jimmy John's. The talks had been confirmed. The deal was coming together at a price of $106.50 per share in cash, a roughly 20% premium over the most recent closing price. The implied enterprise value, including debt, was $11.3 billion. Dunkin' Brands, the last remaining institutional heir to William Rosenberg's 5-cent donut, was about to be absorbed into a portfolio restaurant conglomerate with no particular connection to Massachusetts, or to coffee, or to any of the things that had made this brand what it once was. October 31st, 2020, Atlanta, Georgia. Halloween. The announcement of the Inspire Brands acquisition of Dunkin' Brands goes public on the same day that much of America is preoccupied with costumes and candy, and the day before a presidential election. It is, in some ways, the perfect moment for a corporate transition to slip by without the weight of public ceremony. Inspire Brands is a company that was founded in 2018 by Paul Brown, a former executive at Hilton Hotels and Intercontinental. It is backed by Rourke Capital Group, an Atlanta-based private equity firm. Inspire's stated philosophy is that it acquires iconic brands and maintains their individual identities while providing the operational infrastructure of a major corporation. Its portfolio already includes Arby's, Buffalo Wild Wings, Sonic Drive-In, and Jimmy John's, brands that represent the full spectrum of American fast food without any particular coherence in terms of cuisine, culture, or customer. Dunkin' Brands, which includes both the Dunkin' chain and Baskin-Robbins, fits the portfolio in the sense that it rounds out a breakfast daypart that the other brands do not occupy. The combined entity will have over 31,600 restaurant locations worldwide, more than 600,000 employees, and roughly $26 billion in system-wide annual sales. By any measure, it is a massive transaction, the largest in the restaurant industry since Burger King acquired Tim Hortons in 2014. Dave Hoffman, the CEO of Dunkin' Brands, frames the deal in the vocabulary of triumph. He speaks of the franchise system's grit and determination. He expresses pride in what the team has accomplished during the pandemic. His statement is professional and dignified. It is also the kind of statement that people write when a chapter ends and they are not quite ready to admit it. On December 15, 2020, the acquisition closes. Dunkin' Brands ceases to exist as an independent company. Its shares are delisted from NASDAQ. The pink and orange brand that William Rosenberg invented in a moment of Depression-era necessity is now one item in a private equity portfolio, operating alongside Arby's and Sonic Drive-In without any institutional memory of who made it, why it mattered, and what it once meant to the people who stopped every morning on their way to work. The 5,000-square-foot headquarters in Canton, Massachusetts still exists. The 14,000 global locations still serve coffee. But the thing that connected those locations to the man who shined shoes in Dorchester, that thread is gone. 2021 through 2025, across America and beyond. The years following the Inspire acquisition tell a story of continuing reinvention without a stable center of gravity. Under private ownership, Dunkin' is no longer required to report earnings publicly, a relief to executives navigating the lingering disruptions of the pandemic, but a frustration to analysts and observers trying to understand the brand's trajectory. What filters through comes in press releases, franchise announcements, and occasional industry reports. In early 2025, the company makes a consumer-friendly announcement. It will no longer charge a premium for dairy alternatives such as oat milk in its drinks. The move, undoing a practice that had drawn criticism from younger, health-conscious consumers, is framed as listening to the customer. It is a smart, incremental adjustment. But it is also a symptom of the brand's ongoing identity confusion. Is Dunkin' the place for the construction worker who wants a large, regular coffee? Or is it competing for the yoga studio crowd that orders oat milk matcha? In Malaysia, the brand opens its 100th outlet at Kota Kinabalu International Airport in 2024, spanning 1,800 square meters, the largest Dunkin' location in the country. In Belgium and the Netherlands, however, the company's operations file for bankruptcy in 2024, though the locations remain open. In China, the franchise partnership with Jollibee Foods Corporation collapses. The planned expansion to 100 locations never comes close to materializing. By 2025, Dunkin' has no presence in mainland China at all. Meanwhile, the central production model that had already been quietly shifting for years becomes increasingly consolidated. Fred the baker used to wake before dawn to make fresh donuts on site, and customers could watch through large glass windows as the dough was shaped and glazed. That image, intimate, artisanal, warm, was the founding promise of the brand. It no longer describes the operational reality. At most Dunkin' locations today, the donuts are manufactured in centralized production facilities and delivered by truck. The glass windows still exist, but they no longer frame bakers, they frame walls. The Mid-Main CPL, a major off-site bakery serving Dunkin' franchises, closes its doors in 2025, impacting nearly 100 workers. It is one of many quiet dismantlings that escape public attention. No headline, no ceremony. Just a factory that stops running, and 100 people who have to figure out what is next. The donuts are still there. The freshness is a memory. 2025 and beyond, Quincy, Massachusetts, and everywhere. There is still a Dunkin' at 541 Southern Artery in Quincy, Massachusetts, the address of the original Open Kettle, later the original Dunkin' Donuts. It has been renovated multiple times over the decades. The building no longer resembles what William Rosenberg opened in May of 1948. The menu board is digital. The paper cups carry the simplified Dunkin' logo. No donut in the design, no bakery imagery, just the bold lettering in orange and pink that the company adopted in its rebrand. The store is still open, still serving coffee, and still serving donuts around the clock. The company has 14,000 locations in 39 countries. It processes millions of transactions a day. Its mobile app has tens of millions of users. Ben Affleck appears in Super Bowl commercials. Ice Spice endorses its cold brew. The brand generates social media impressions in the billions. By the metrics that the modern attention economy uses to measure relevance, Dunkin' is not dying. It is adapting. But adaptation is not the same as identity. And what has been lost in the journey from William Rosenberg's borrowed $1,000 to an $11.3 billion acquisition by a private equity restaurant conglomerate is something that no marketing campaign can entirely replace. The brand was once an honest expression of a particular kind of American life. The people who built it, the Dorchester boy who dropped out of school, the franchise owners in Quebec who fought for their businesses all the way to the Court of Appeal, the workers who spent 30 years wearing Dunkin' uniforms, the franchisees who opened at 4 in the morning because Fred the baker told them that was what you did. They did not build it as a beverage-led platform for digital loyalty program monetization. They built it because coffee and donuts, done simply and done well, were two of the most reliable pleasures available to people who did not have much money and did not have much time. What Starbucks understood, and what Dunkin' never fully grasped, is that identity is a competitive advantage that cannot be purchased or rebranded. Starbucks sold aspiration and never apologized for it. Dunkin' sold authenticity and then grew embarrassed of it. It dropped the donut from its name. It installed espresso machines it did not need. It chased a customer who had already chosen someone else. The empire did not collapse. It faded, quietly, from something specific into something generic. Return to that original Quincy storefront. Stand outside it on a Tuesday morning in February. The cars line up at the drive-through window. A delivery driver in a reflective vest walks out with 2 paper bags and a tray of coffees. Inside, behind the digital menu board, a young employee in an orange visor moves quickly between the coffee station and the display case. The donuts are arranged in neat rows. The place smells like it always has. Hot oil and fresh coffee and paper and the particular warmth of early morning. If you look closely, the address is still there. 541 Southern Artery. The building that was once an awning store, then the open kettle, then the first Dunkin' Donuts in the world. It does not announce itself. There is no historical plaque outside, no marker of the empire that was built here, spread to 14,000 locations, absorbed a competitor founded by its founder's own partner, lost an entire country, survived a pandemic, and was ultimately consumed by a holding company based in Atlanta. 3 things broke this brand, and they were all of its own making. The first is the failure of loyalty, not to customers, but to the people who held the franchise agreements in good faith. When the parent company looked away as Tim Hortons dismantled its Quebec franchisees 1 location at a time, and when it responded to their warnings with renovation programs too expensive to execute, it violated the foundational promise that franchising is built upon. The legal bill was $18 million. The market loss was irreversible. The second is the failure of identity. A brand that spent 68 years building its reputation on the democratizing simplicity of coffee and donuts should not be ashamed of the word donut. The moment Dunkin' dropped that word, it announced to the world that it was unsure of what it was. Consumers read that uncertainty even when they cannot articulate it. They go elsewhere. The third is the failure of succession. William Rosenberg knew what the brand was because he invented it from lived experience. Every successive owner, from Allied Lions to Allied Domecq to Pernod Ricard to Bain Capital to Inspire Brands, has been further removed from that original understanding. An organization run by people who have no felt connection to its founding purpose will eventually begin optimizing for metrics rather than meaning. The numbers tell a specific story. 72 years from founding to acquisition, peak global sales of $6 billion. From 0 locations in 1948 to over 14,000 in 2024. From a Dorchester Dropout's first truck to an $11.3 billion sale. What is left is something that still works, still serves millions, still smells like morning. But somewhere between the first cup of coffee William Rosenberg charged 10 cents for, and the cold brew that Ben Affleck holds in a Super Bowl commercial, the thing that made it irreplaceable quietly walked out the door, and nobody made a donut in its honor.